Hello and welcome to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. This is episode 3 of the weekly Story Savvy series, where we tackle the 52 biggest self editing topics and tips to help you make your good story great as an aspiring author asks me, a developmental editor, all of the questions you've wanted to.
Hi, my name is Agnes Wolf, an aspiring fantasy author who hopes to release her first middle grade fantasy later this year. And I am also the host and founder of Authors Alcove.
I am so excited to dive into what to do with your genre choice once you have made it, including meeting reader expectations, researching what's expected, and when cliche is okay. By the end of this episode, you'll hopefully feel confident in using your genre choices in the drafting and editing process, making sure your story will satisfy your genre readers. So, how are you feeling about your genre choices for your book?
I'm feeling pretty good, except now that I know what the genre is, what do I do with that information? How can knowing your genre help during the editing process, which I'm working on right now?
Knowing what needs to be delivered around your genre promise is vital to all genre fiction. It doesn't matter if you're writing romance or action or, kids books, anything like that. Knowing what your genre expects and what has been built into those expectations and those labels is vital to satisfying your readers. If your goal is career oriented or reader oriented, then having success in those arenas is vital to using your genre and doing so both in a way that fits what's expected and innovates on that. If you're writing for yourself, as I mentioned in last week's episode, this does not matter. You can do whatever makes you happy because you are your only reader, and what you want to read and write is your only genre promise. But if you want to write to a larger audience, then hitting the right tropes and requirements is absolutely important.
So I feel like conventions and tropes are often confused with one another because I've learned that they're different. So tell me if you agree. I have heard conventions are requirements of your genre and tropes are what's commonly found in a genre. But do
This is a
you
great question, and this is definitely somewhere where the language around the topic can get very, very murky. So, the way that I try to talk about it is that you have tropes, which, like you said, are optional things that you can put into a book. So, for example, you could have a dragon trope in fantasy, but it can be fantasy without a dragon trope. You can have there's only one bed trope in romance, but it's still a romance and works fine if you don't have that trope. So tropes are sort of the major flavor points within your subgenre choices. Conventions are things that are often seen. So in fantasy, especially in high fantasy, which we've established is what you're writing, a convention is that it is in a medieval style world. But it doesn't have to be there. It's something that is often seen, but not it's not going to ruin the genre if you choose not to use it. Now, moving on from that, and what I'm mostly going to be talking about today is requirements of the genre, which is things like fantasy has magic, romance has a happily ever after, as well as obligatory elements. And in that's basically just a more specific way of talking about these requirements. So, an obligatory character in fantasy and most action related genres is you have a mentor figure. An obligatory moment in romance is there has to be a first kiss. So that's mostly what I'm going to be focusing on today because things like tropes and conventions are very much up to your creative interests and what you're wanting to do with the story, whereas requirements and obligatory moments or characters or I don't even know, just setting things are built into the genre to the point where if you leave them out, you're not going to satisfy your genre readers.
so once I've decided what my genre and subgenre is, how do I know what I need to deliver to satisfy those requirements and expectations? For example, what do middle grader fantasy readers expect? What is the conventions for middle grade fantasy readers?
So I'm going to answer this a little bit more broadly first for any of our listeners who are writing outside of middle grade fantasy. And the answer is research. It really, really is. And obviously, the advice of if you want to write, you have to read broadly is ubiquitous at this point if you've done any research. But I want to recommend that you read as a researcher more than just, hey, I'm reading to read. And you can do this however works best for you. Have a notebook next to you. I use spreadsheets because I'm a spreadsheet kind of person. But as you're reading through, just start noticing specifically what commonalities there are between, let's say, 3 to 7 books in your genre that you're like, yes, that looks very similar to what I want to write, to what I want to present to the world. When you're reading them, just write down anything that comes up in your head of, oh, that other book also had a moment of, let's say, um, the FMC, the female main character, runs into someone that she used to know and they make her feel bad. Or, talking about a little more perhaps understood or widely known obligatory moments would be like, okay, well, all of the romance books that I read have a breakup around the midpoint. And all of the romance books that I read have some reason that the main characters feel like they'll never be in love again and oh, they could never fall in love and then they do. So everything that you can think of like that you see across all of these different books in your genre should go on your list. And once you have this list, ideally, again, spreadsheets are nice for this. You can mark like, okay, well, not every book has this, but 3 out of 5 do, or 2 out of 7 had this. And when you go through, the tropes or the moments, the characters, whatever you want to call it, that occur in all or nearly all books are should be considered your genre expectations, and you should be doing everything that you can to meet those expectations in your way, in your specific way, however you want to approach them in your work in order to satisfy those readers. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So, like, more specifically, what about middle grade fantasy dragon books?
So, I'm gonna tell you, you need to go do this research yourself, but for coming from me, right off the top of my head, some of the requirements would be, let's see, the dragons there should be different varieties of dragons. That's one of the things that I see all the time. There's almost always some connection, be that like magic or telekinesis or mind reading between a human and a dragon. There's some sort of bond there. And there has to be some sense of either rarity or otherness with the dragons. That's another trope that I often see. So either, oh, well, they were thought to be extinct, but now there's one left, or well, they are these elder god kind of beings, and they see us lowly humans as, dirt under their feet. So that sort of connection to then be gapped or sorry, bridged by that connection with the human, and that's what makes the story special.
So it sounds like even though I wasn't really 100% sure that I had check, check, check. So I apparently there like it's pretty intuitive as long as we're a big reader of that particular genre, subgenre.
Absolutely. And that's why you don't really need to do this research, before you draft, especially if you're a heavy reader in the genre. And it's really fun to go through and be like, "Oh, well, I did hit that convention without even noticing it. Oh, I did totally hit that requirement. I didn't even realize it." And I want to really stress that you can interpret things pretty loosely. So, especially in romance, I see people thinking that it's so very, very formulaic, and some of it is, absolutely. But you don't have to do a moment or a character or an event the exact same way that anyone else did. You just have to hit that sort of emotional moment. So the mentor doesn't have to be a Gandalf type because that is kind of overdone at this point. Your mentor could be the main character's niece. As long as she is fulfilling that sort of emotional role in the story, it counts. So when you're making your list of conventions or requirements or tropes or whatever in your genre, and then trying to check and make sure that you have these things in your story, especially in the self-editing phase, please feel free to stretch those definitions. Please feel free to go, okay, well, I guess that kind of counts. And then see if, there's a couple of sentences where you could tweak it to just be a little bit more dead on for that emotional impact. But yeah, having read your genre, you're gonna know some of them without even thinking about it, and they're already gonna be there, and you're just not gonna have to worry about it.
So I'm not sure if you've already answered this, but how can we test whether our book meets the expectations of its genre?
So I have already mentioned doing research and reading widely and making those lists. The other really important part of this is getting feedback, and specifically getting feedback from people who know your genre. It's amazing how often I see people getting feedback from readers who have never read their genre or from editors who don't specialize in their genre. And sure, they can catch typos. They can tell you when a character's dialogue is off. They can catch that sort of like line level or copy level issues. But if you want to match your genre expectations, you have to make sure that your alpha readers, your beta readers, your critique partners, your developmental editors, whoever you're working with, knows your genre well enough to be able to give you feedback on the genre requirements. So if you have, a police procedural and you are in a group of romantic fantasy writers, they're not going to be able to give you the feedback that you need for nailing your genre because they don't know what's needed and what's expected.
So are there certain pitfalls common to specific genres that I should be wary of? Like, for example, are there tropes that are expected in some fantasy genres but will turn someone off in others?
Yes, and especially for writing middle grade. And I did touch on this briefly in our episode 1 about picking your audience, because some things that would be absolutely vital in fantasy romance, namely all of the romance tropes and obligatory moments and characters and all of this stuff, are going to gross out the average 10-year-old. So, especially when you get into any topics that you would see listed on like a movie rating, like, oh, okay, drugs, alcohol, violence, gore, romance, explicit language, anything like that, anything that you might list in a trigger warning list in the beginning of your book are by far the most likely to be that. Some genres, I'm thinking specifically fantasy romance and dark romance, they are built around some of those aspects, especially dark romance. Like they've got trigger warnings for pages at the beginning, but that's what those readers want. It's called dark romance because it has those elements. But if you put those elements into genres where the readers don't want that or aren't expecting that, then that is absolutely going to turn them off. It's going to make them speak badly about your book. So again, it just comes back to that research and knowing what your subgenre specifically and your content subgenres very, very specifically expect and absolutely never show. So when you're making those lists of what's expected in your genres, those things to make sure that you have, it might be worth also listing the things that you are thinking about putting into your work, but that never appear in your comparison books.
So one thing that I'm kind of concerned about, especially because I sometimes feel like my book is very similar to a lot of other middle grade readers. And so I'm
Mhm.
worried about being too cliche. So how do I know which tropes, characters, and plot are a required part of the genre and which ones could be just a little too cliche? And does it really matter in middle grades?
Well, you have a good point there where middle grade are not going to care about cliche nearly as much as pretty much every other genre out there. Kids books might be the older you get, the more cliche is an issue. And again, I'm going to point you back to research, but for this question specifically, I want to really encourage folks to look at the review sections of their comp titles, because that's where you're gonna see, 1, 2, 3-star reviews that go, "Oh, well, this was just so predictable about XYZ. This was so cliche. It really bugged me that they just were so formulaic." And you can take that information and contrast it against that book's or other books, 4, 5-star reviews that say, "Oh, they did such a unique job with the magic system," or the breakup in the romance or something like that. And at the end of the day, if you don't want to do research, if you don't want to get feedback, my recommendation is that you always go for a thought further down the chain than first. Let me explain that. I know it's not clear. So if you're writing a book and you think, "Oh, I want to have dragons." That's great. Now keep brainstorming. Don't just stop at dragons. Go to, all right, well, I want to have dragons who are a lot bigger than most that I've seen. Okay, well, that's okay, but that's probably also been done. Okay, let's go a step further. How about there's a big size difference, like range? Like they come every size from like parakeet to mountain. Okay, that's getting more innovative. And you can just keep going down that chain, and it doesn't matter what your genre is, it doesn't matter what your subgenre, your content genre, anything like that is. If you go with your first idea on anything, it's probably cliche. But if you sit with that and you go, okay, well, what if, what if, what if, what if, what if, and you just take it, 3 or 4 or 17 steps further down this idea chain, you are far more likely to avoid cliche and get to something that is innovative while staying within whatever the tropes, conventions, requirements, obligatory moments that are expected.
So this might be a little bit more towards like middle grade writers, but I want to ask anyway. Is it too cliche or is it okay to have a villain be a little more evil with less roundedness than am I right for like an older person? My villain comes kind of across very evil, especially in the book I'm working on right now, kind of like Voldemort is in the Harry
Okay.
Potter series. But I do have a backstory. It's just how important is it to share that with my audience and when? Especially and I guess this might be a little bit different because middle grade is a little bit different than, like, older.
Yeah. So again, as the ages of your single audience member, your target audience, however you want to define that, goes up, the expectations of innovation go up. So for writing middle grade, it's totally fine to have a very villainous villain. Uh, but for any genre, for any age setting, my advice there is you don't have to give them full backstory by any means, but the younger the audience is, the simpler their motive needs to be. So having a villain whose motive is, past trauma that they never got therapy for and they've just, not metabolized that well works for adults, but for kids it needs to be something like, "Oh, I want that property that you have because I am greedy." Like, you need to put it in, second grade language. It needs to be understandable to your audience. And again, going back to that audience, you have to know who you're telling the story to. And the reason that the villain is villain has to be clear to that person, to that audience. So if you're writing middle grade, you that has to make sense to a 10-year-old. So just out of curiosity, how would you state your villain's reason for the bad things that they do right now?
What's power?
Okay. But why does he want power? Is he greedy? Does he want to rule the world? Like, even just saying he wants power is a bit too vague. It needs to
He wants
be
to rule the world.
okay, yeah, and that works great for middle grade. And if this was adult fiction, if this was, say, epic high fantasy, you need a little more nuance, but not for middle grade ages, probably.
It is more nuanced, but you won't find that out until, like, later. But,
Sure,
like, the first
fair.
book, you won't know, and
And that works fine for this genre, especially if the villain is carrying over a series.
so, what exactly happens if we miss important parts of our genre? And this might be a separate question, but are there risks to intentionally breaking or ignoring genre conventions?
So I've already answered the first part of that in the last 2 episodes and earlier in this one, which is basically you're either not gonna get picked up and read by people in the first place, or you're gonna disappoint the people who pick it up and read it, and they might not finish it, and they probably won't recommend it to folks. That's really what we're talking about in not meeting genre. As far as breaking it goes, I know this is cliched advice, but don't break the rules until you know how to follow them. So if you're starting out writing, Write at least 3 books where you meet all of the requirements, and then you can start thinking about breaking them because, like I'd mentioned earlier in this episode, a lot of these promises have to do with the emotional landscape, have to do with how you make the reader or the protagonist or whoever feel with these things. And when you're breaking the rules, you're changing that emotional landscape. And it can still work. It can be a good different landscape. But until you know how to create a good landscape the way that the rules tell you to, you're not going to understand well enough how to create a different landscape that still delivers catharsis and satisfaction and whatever that core genre promise, or sorry, that core emotional promise of your genre is. And I'm going to branch off because I meant to talk about that earlier. A lot of genre comes down to the emotional promise as well. And I should have talked about this in the last episode, but just to give you a very brief overview, romance's emotional promise is love, obviously. The emotional promise of, um, let's say, police procedural is justice. That is the emotion that you need to either provide or very noticeably fail to provide for good reason. So when you're looking at breaking your genre conventions, tropes, expectations, whatever you want to call it, if you're just starting out doing so, I highly recommend making sure that you are at least delivering the right emotional highs and lows where they are expected to be.
So I know we need to wrap up, but I did want to ask one last question. We had talked, I think it was in our last episode, about the book that we both read, and you're expecting dark fantasy. So I have a title for my book, one I am in love with, but am not sure if it's a right for its genre, because
Mhm.
I have heard that titles are one of the biggest and most important ways to signal genre, as well as book covers. How
Yeah.
can I make sure my title helps my reader know what to expect?
Great question to end on. So, I've talked a fair bit in this episode about how to meet expectations while still, interpreting them loosely or putting your own specialness into it. And that very much applies with your title and your cover. So, again, going back to that research. To be fair, this research goes much faster than reading full books. Just go to those Amazon categories or the bookshelf in your local bookstore and don't write down like what words are used in titles necessarily, but look at the formats. So my niche genre, romantic fantasy, is like really well known for having a really formulaic title format right now in what books are coming out, and it's often a blank of blank and blank. So write down the sort of the formats like that. For example, one of my favorite YA series is The Subtle Knife, and those book titles are The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass. And all of those fit into that, template that you can see, the underscore, underscore, the underscore, underscore. So take a note of what title templates you're seeing a lot, especially in the top 100. You don't want to be studying books that aren't doing well. You want to be studying the books that are succeeding. And the same with the cover. For example, urban fantasy almost always has a hot lady with lots of curves and long blonde hair wearing tight black leather posed with magic on the cover. Like it's so ubiquitous. But there's a reason it is because that title format or that cover style tells the reader what they're getting. It tells them that they're getting romantic fantasy or it tells them that they're getting urban fantasy with a female lead. So look at those formats, those oh, that's not the word I'm looking for. Template. And then put in whatever attaches to the core of your story. And that's what we're going to talk about next week is what makes your story special? What is what is its special sauce? And I hate that term, but I can't think of a better one right now. So what you want to do with matching the your book to your genre is use the right templates and then put something special into it. So that your ideal readers, like we talked about in episode 1, can look at it and go, "Oh, that's the genre that I want with the right tone that I want. But why should I pick up this one instead of the one next to it?" The template tells them that they're getting what they want, and putting your specialness into that template convinces them to pick it up instead of the other one next to it.
Thank you again so much for your insight. Has helped me so much.
Of course, hitting your genre requirements is truly the foundation of good or successful genre fiction, no matter what your genre is. Next week, like I said, we'll talk about building on this by getting down into the unique heart of specific stories beyond genre or audience, much more internal, much more specific to the individual author. For now, I really want to thank our listeners. If you could please help us out by liking and subscribing to the Heartbound Editing Podcast and the Author's Alcove Podcast, we'd be very grateful, and you can find lots more content for fantasy authors and readers beyond this joint series.
And I can't wait to talk about the heart of a story. Thank you so much. See you then.
Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make a good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.